If you're a fan of any kind of fantasy, you undoubtedly know about Lord of the Rings. With its beautiful story, complex characters, and its imaginative and colorful world. The significance of Lord of the Rings for the fantasy and sci-fi genres as a whole cannot be understated. If you were to ask any fantasy writer, chances are today, they would cite Tolkien as an influence in some way. His world building, personalities, and character archetypes have influenced nearly every corner of literature in a profound way. To be honest, just sitting down to write this episode was a daunting task. There's so much lore in Middle-earth, including its expanded universe. Where do you even start? Now, in case you didn't already know, not only was Tolkien influenced by many religious, spiritual, philosophical, and even metaphysical sources, but there are even numerous underlying spiritual messages throughout his work that holds great wisdom if you know where to look and how to apply it. To start with, since there's so much to cover, we should point out that we're going to be doing it on a movie/book-by-book basis, starting with this episode on the Fellowship and ending with Return of the King to wrap it up. Now, at its heart, the central theme of Lord of the Rings is the quest. On its surface, we see a kind of normal fantasy thing. The heroes have to overcome the Dark Lord by going on this great journey of self-discovery to vanquish the darkness, both in the world and within themselves. And in Lord of the Rings, it's depicted through the temptation of the One Ring and the journey to save Middle-earth from its destruction. But where Lord of the Rings begins to get very interesting is when you look at the actual pacing of it. The story is completely flipped on its head compared to your average story trope. See, the heroes are not seeking a treasure, but are questing to destroy one instead. If you were to look at the same story from Sauron's point of view, the tale really is a quest, with Sauron trying to get the treasure back, with the evil Black Riders replacing the traditional errant knights seeking the holiest of holies. In that sense, Sauron kind of is like evil King Arthur, and the ring is like the evil Grail. Interesting. The movie begins with a bit of a backstory, giving us an awareness of the rings and the races. We learn about the villain, Sauron, who forged the rings of power and delivered them to the leaders of the races who could be controlled, humans, elves, and dwarves. These rings, bestowing power to the bearers, also binds them to the Dark Lord, which sets the spiritual tone of the story. The idea that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the deception that evil will use to ensnare others. In giving these rings to the leaders of the three races, Sauron essentially inflicts his hold upon the world. But as Sauron's power grows, there are also those who fight back, and we see the fall of Sauron at the hands of Isildur, but who is unable to destroy it. Another powerful lesson for us still, the temptation that power has over us. What could this ring represent? The story says that into the ring, Sauron poured his cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life. And so the ring ultimately comes to represent these qualities in the form of greed. This can be reflected in our daily lives as any kind of temptation, such as money, fame, or sex, all of which can be used to subjugate or manipulate others into doing what you want. In addition to this, the ring bestows the wearer with invisibility, providing a false sense of security, which we also see in this idea of greed. For as you generate more money or fame or what have you, it gives you this sense of security. But true security, as the story also teaches us, comes from our connections that we have with our friends and our family. One of the things that Sauron creates is feelings of absolute despair through facilitating the creation of evil forces, such as manipulating Saruman to do his bidding in creating an army of orcs and Uruk-hai. Gandalf, on the other hand, has the reverse power, supporting everyone to resist the temptation of despair and rekindling hope and courage wherever he goes. That Tolkien was conceiving these works during England's darkest days during World War II gives a special context to this power to resist fear and despair and kindle hope in its place. It would seem also that Tolkien uses this narrative, especially the easily swayed humans, to describe the overinflated ego and the dangers of what can happen when your desire and ambition are left unchecked. From this viewpoint, it appears that the Fellowship is on a quest to destroy the ego and ultimately free the world from the dark influence of desire and temptation. Tolkien had lived through 2 world wars, including the routine bombardment of civilians, the use of famine for personal gain, concentration camps and genocide, and the development and use of chemical and nuclear weapons. And so much of this story, although based in a different world than ours, is very much rooted emotionally and contextually in very serious and real events in history. The story raises the question of whether, if the ability of humans to produce that kind of evil could somehow be destroyed, even at the cost of sacrificing something, would be worth doing. Now, if any of this talk of desire, temptation, and evil sounds familiar, that's because Tolkien was devoutly Catholic, a trait which he himself admitted to having been a profound influence on his writing. While it is interesting that he never included a direct form of religion in his main body of work, the themes, moral philosophy, and cosmology of The Lord of the Rings reflects his Catholic worldview. Christian themes are ever present in so much of his work, more so in the later books, especially Return of the King, which we'll cover when we get there. There are many ideas that focus around death, resurrection, forgiveness, grace, repentance, and of course, free will. In fact, even Tolkien himself said, "Of course God is in The Lord of the Rings. The period was pre-Christian, but it was a monotheistic world. And when questioned who was the one God of Middle-earth, Tolkien replied, 'The one, of course. The book is about the world that God created, the actual world of this planet.'" Delving a bit deeper into the language of Middle-earth, even the name itself comes from the Norse Midgard, which was the name for our Earth. In fact, the influence of Norse mythology for Tolkien was huge. There are some really good videos out there on YouTube that talk about the mythology of Lord of the Rings. So if you want to go deeper, we really recommend looking this up. Everything from the characters to the environments are so rich in symbolic meaning. Let's take Gandalf, for instance. Speaking purely from Tolkien's point of view, Gandalf was mostly based off of the Norse god Odin, who is a bit different from the Marvel version that you're probably familiar with. Odin in Norse mythology is described as the Wanderer, an old man with one eye, a long white beard, a wide-brimmed hat, and a staff. Tolkien, in a 1946 letter, nearly a decade after the character was invented, wrote that he thought of Gandalf as an Odinic wanderer. Much like Odin, Gandalf promotes justice, knowledge, truth, and insight. In fact, his battle with the Balrog in the Mines of Moria was meant to spiritually mirror that of the battle with Surtur, the fire giant in Norse mythology, with the ensuing collapse of the Bridge of Khazad-dûm mirroring the prophesied collapse of the Bifrost during Ragnarok. Interestingly though, it should be said that Ragnarok was not seen as the end of the world as it is often thought of, but rather the transition into a new cycle. And this is essentially what happens in the Fellowship. With the fall of the Balrog and the collapse of the bridge, it gives way for the journey to unfold. Gandalf had to fall in order to be reborn as a higher, more ascended and powerful being than he was before. As we looked at, there are several key races in the story, of which seem to spiral around the elements. This is not spelled out directly by Tolkien, but it would appear as though the humans reflect the element of fire, showing their passionate ways, leadership qualities, and also a bit of their own destructive power. And also in Return of the King, we see that it is time for humans to take the throne as the new world leaders, further reflecting the fire being the closest to the Godhead in the alchemical systems. The dwarves are earth for probably obvious reasons. The elves are air, with their both living in the trees, their precision, their mental acuity, and awareness of the world. And hobbits as water, being natural, flowing, and most importantly, having nurturing qualities, a trait that is often described as the highest form of the divine feminine, manifested through the alchemical element of water or the emotional body. If we were to count wizards and orcs, we would see angels and demons join the fray with the elements of ether and voidness, the latter of which stands for a lack of substance. Now, speaking of hobbits, the Shire itself represents an idyllic haven where the hobbits live in harmony with nature and each other, creating an environment of peace, love, and pleasure. Even though not all hobbits get along and are particularly stuck in their ways are that of connection with the spirit of the earth. In many ways, living in the Shire might be what we would think would be the end goal for many characters, a peaceful haven where evil doesn't exist, reminiscent of the English countrysides. As the story opens, we see Bilbo celebrating his 111st birthday, which in the book also just happens to be on the same day as Frodo celebrating his coming of age birthday as he turns 33. In sacred numerology, 111 signifies manifestation and prosperity. This number's main symbolism is manifesting thoughts into reality, and is also said to symbolize awareness, uniqueness, motivation, and spiritual awakening. This makes sense as shortly after Bilbo's celebrations, he slips away to go on a new journey in his life. Frodo's age is also hugely significant, as 33 in Christian numerology is the age that Jesus was when he was crucified, in the year 33 AD. We might even go as far as to say that no number holds more esoteric significance than 33. The number 3 is significant in all major religions, with there being a trinity for Christians and even a trinity of goddesses or deities in many ancient cultures. The number 33 was also important to secret societies and is often concealed within significant literary works. There are even 33 degrees in modern Freemasonry. At the Vatican, there are 32 archways on each side of the courtyard with a giant obelisk in the middle. And the Pope's cassock has 32 buttons with his head representing the 33rd. Furthermore, the first Temple of Solomon stood for 33 years before being pillaged. Alexander the Great also died at 33, and Pope John Paul I was murdered after being in power for only 33 days. And if that all wasn't interesting enough, in the movies, we see all of this happen on the 22nd of September. So altogether, we have 111, 22, and a hidden 33. When we first meet Bilbo and Gandalf, Bilbo is unwilling to give up the ring, a sign of being unable to let go of his worldly attachments and temptations. Eventually, after much persuasion from the wizard, he gives it up and is relieved of a huge burden, symbolic of him relieving his ego of its duty. When Gandalf returns later to visit Frodo, he casts the ring into the fireplace, revealing the engraved Elvish script. Isn't it remarkable how the black speech of Mordor can be so beautiful and yet so evil at the same time? It's a scenario reminiscent of Lucifer, who is said to be the most beautiful of God's angels, don't you think? Along with strength of will, the value of wisdom is also integral to the underlying spirituality of Lord of the Rings. Although I'm sure Tolkien never intended it this way, we find the elves to be an embodiment of and reminiscent of Taoist wisdom. Like the Taoist sages, the elves, for the most part, are free of the discontent that so affects humans. They love the natural world and govern their lives in harmony with it. They dedicate their creative power to fashioning things of beauty that enhance the natural world without damaging it. Their dwellings bring to mind the dwellings in the great Taoist landscapes, habitations in harmony with their environments. All of this, like the ideal government of the Tao Te Ching, is so at odds with our actual world that fantasy is an apt term for it. But it does bring to mind the kind of world that beings who are born with inner contentment might create. And in doing so, reminds us of the degree that the world we have in fact created is much born out of our own discontentment. Leading up to their meeting in Rivendell, Frodo is stabbed by a Nazgul blade that begins to slowly infect him, which Aragorn says can only be healed by elven magic. If we look at it from a higher perspective, the Nazgul are creatures of necromancy, fueled by dark magic and hatred. By being stabbed, perhaps that hatred and despair begins to slowly enter Frodo, and given that elven magic is born solely out of love and compassion, it is the only thing that can heal a wound of fear and hatred. Much like his own current situation, love is the only true remedy for fear. It is no coincidence that Frodo meets Bilbo here again, as the environment itself is one of healing and repentance. Now, the first book and movie is called The Fellowship of the Ring, and on a base level, it arguably represents the bonds of brotherhood and family, and this idea that no one race is better than another. In this, we find that even once enemies can become friends, such as Legolas and Gimli. Although the fellowship was not meant to last, the establishing of this shared intention between all of them is ultimately what allows the entire story to transpire once they reach Rivendell. During the Council of Elrond, we see that the presence of the ring and the conversation stirs everyone to arms with each other. And truly, if each of them tried to destroy the ring on their own, they would all fail and ultimately become corrupted by its power. The only one who can do it is Frodo, because he represents the purity and innocence of the natural soul. And even then, the ring still gets to him slowly but surely by the end. Nevertheless, only by having a united fellowship made up of each of the world's races can they hope to succeed. There is undeniably a lesson of cooperation here. Only by working together and lifting each other up can we accomplish something seemingly impossible. There is more power in unity than in separation. From a spiritual perspective, perhaps a lesson here is that by creating and maintaining an environment of mutual trust and harmony, and working together and creating a space for that kind of movement and growth to occur, can we too do the impossible and curb our own desires and egos, allowing us to exist in harmony with our world collectively. Also, it is interesting that the fellowship numbers 9 people, 2 humans, an elf, a dwarf, 4 hobbits, and a wizard, along with there being 9 Nazgul. There's probably some strong numerology in there somewhere, as 9 is a very significant number numerologically. But for now, let's just say that the 2 groups create a sense of balance, one for one, so to speak. Throughout the story, we also see the theme of personal sacrifice over and over. I wonder if this was inspired by Tolkien's own spirituality, reflecting Jesus, who gave his own life because it was what must be done. Frodo went on the journey to take the ring to Rivendell, and then all the way to Mount Doom, sacrificing his old life, his old way of being, and things would never be the same again for him. Further, it was Gandalf's decision to allow Frodo the choice to take either the mines or the mountains after leaving Rivendell, a choice which ultimately led to Gandalf's death and Christ-like resurrection. While the majority of these scenes take place in the next film, it is significant that Gandalf dies fulfilling his purpose, protecting and guiding the others. In doing so, he is allowed to return to life as a much more leveled up Gandalf the White, taking the place of Saruman as the benevolent white wizard. The color symbolism here cannot go unmentioned, as his transition from gray to white is arguably symbolic of him shedding the veil of night, to quote our good friend Thoth from the Emerald Tablets, and becoming a true ascended being. This transition into ascension is also present with Galadriel in Lothlorien towards the very end of the film. For people who have only seen the movie version of The Lord of the Rings, we see a little context for Galadriel's actions and words after she resists taking the ring. Even the book version does not provide the full context, but in the appendices at the end of The Return of the King and in the Silmarillion, we learn that Galadriel's character flaw is the desire for power. This flaw she shares with her ancestors who were exiled from the far west due largely to their pride and aggression. Though sharing in this exile, Galadriel was always torn by her love of the world and its beauty and her desire for power. Through the ages of Middle-earth, she steadfastly pitted her will against the will of Sauron, and in doing so, served in the protection of beauty and harmony against chaos and destruction. With this background, we can better understand the scene where Galadriel finally is offered the Ring of Power by Frodo. A part of her had obviously long desired for such an opportunity, yet she is able to resist this temptation, and in doing so, she finally can relinquish her desire for power. Having done this, she knows that the condition of her exile has been lifted, and she can now return to the far west, symbolic of her own ascension and moving into a new life for herself. Even the gifts of Lothlorien themselves have spiritual meaning. Frodo's light of Erendil that illuminates the darkness seems to signify light as a purifying energy that provides hope, warmth, and shows the way. Interestingly, there is a slight difference in the gifts that Sam gets from Galadriel. In the movie, he receives an elven rope, but in the book, he receives soil from Galadriel's garden and a seed, which he uses to replant the trees in the Shire after it's destroyed, signifying a spiritual rebirth and ultimately the resurrection of the earth. The movie ends with Frodo disbanding the Fellowship under the guise that the ring holds too much temptation to be able to keep the group together. Once again, he makes a heavy sacrifice for what he sees as the greatest good. But like always, love is still the answer. Samwise, knowing Frodo as a friend, immediately guesses where he's going and follows him into what is quite literally the mouth of hell, signifying that the bonds of brotherhood and family transcend even the darkest of darkness. As we continue our journey into Middle-earth, we find ourselves at a crossroads between book and movie. This film in particular is quite different from its source material. During production, Jackson and the other screenwriters made some plot decisions that changed the structure of the story. Ultimately, a very important thing that had to be done in order for this film series to be a trilogy and not a very long miniseries. So to keep things simple, we're gonna keep focusing more on the movie and the message it portrays, but we'll continue to explore some relevant bits and pieces from the books as we go along. Now, the movie opens with a continuation of the plot from the end of Fellowship and has Frodo and Sam lost in Emyn Muil on their journey towards Mordor. They quickly learn that they are being stalked by the creature Gollum, the ring's former owner, who has been twisted into a monster. The ring has extended his life well beyond its natural limits, and Tolkien tells us that he both loved and hated the ring as he loved and hated himself. We can see his corruption demonstrated very well by the fact that Gollum is burned by the elven rope, as the elves stand for purity. It's something that he in his corruption cannot touch without hurting him. It's the same with elven food. He just can't eat it. Thematically, and to a certain extent spiritually, Gollum serves countless roles in the story, and one of the most popular theories about Gollum is that he constitutes some kind of psychological pairing for Frodo. Following Carl Jung's theory of individualization, Gollum seems to play a role of Frodo's shadow self in many ways, an aspect of his unconscious, the id, that Frodo's ego doesn't identify with. And because one tends to reject or remain ignorant of the least desirable aspects of one's personality, the shadow is mostly negative. As we've begun to explore previously in Fellowship, the concept of duality and pairing seems to be a common theme in Lord of the Rings. Denethor is arguably a shadow for Theoden, Boromir for Aragorn, Saruman for Gandalf, Shelob for Galadriel due to their connection in the cycles of the creation of Middle-earth, and many others. But the Gollum-Frodo one is the most widely known and discussed. Gollum expresses his shadowy nature with this little poem.
Cold we heart and hand and bone, and cold we travellers far from home. We do not see what lies ahead when sun has failed and moon is dead.
This is very deep, alluding to the darkness within the hidden unconscious. The illuminating light has passed into night. We have grown cold, and there is something we must face in order to pass into the next chapter of our lives. What's more, during this very scene, Frodo reveals Smeagol's true name, which ignites within Gollum the re-emergence of a portion of his original identity, giving him his own dualistic split personality throughout the story. Now, alternatively, a Tolkien scholar named Charles Nelson sees Gollum as a kind of lousy psychopomp, a corrupted soul who tries to overtake the ring from the main characters, but who does, in fact, still lead them to Mordor. This is, of course, in stark contrast to Gandalf, who takes the role of the good guide, similar to Virgil guiding Dante through the Inferno. And side note, did you know there's a whole extra 2 stories after Dante's Inferno where he goes through purgatory and descends up to heaven? Wild stuff. Yet it's interesting that we only ever hear about the Inferno. Anyway, Nelson makes a good point saying that both Gollum and Gandalf are servants of the one, Eru Iluvatar, the god in the Lord of the Rings universe mentioned in the Silmarillion. In the struggle against the forces of darkness, with Gandalf fighting off external forces of evil, and Smeagol fighting his own inner demons, and all of them, good and bad, being necessary to the success of the quest. From this, we can explore this idea in our own lives. We must face our challenges both internally and externally in order to create lasting harmony. However you feel about Gollum, there is no denying that he is essential to the quest, as without him, Frodo and Sam would still be lost in the wilderness right now. Along with this, we also hear lines in the story such as, even the corrupted and evil souls, those who dwell in darkness, have a place in our story, reminding us that they, more than anyone, hold a mirror for us to hold compassion for those who have taken a dark path. Further, we are reminded by the impact of the ring upon Frodo, that the innate capacity for both light and dark can be seeded and nurtured within anyone, even the purest of people. Writing in the Mythlore Journal, David Calloway delved a bit deeper into this idea. He describes Gollum as being not wholly evil and being able to make moral choices, and that like many of the characters, is manipulated by the One Ring in a kind of cosmic chess game. Even Gandalf at one point remarks that Gollum has some part to play yet, for good or ill. What's truly amazing throughout the story is Frodo's continuous and unending forgiveness of Gollum, and his unwillingness to let Sam hurt him. As we know, Tolkien loved inserting Christian moral values into his text with the intent of teaching his readers a thing or two. Chief among them are the virtues of grace and forgiveness, 2 of the most core tenets of Christianity. This is nowhere more powerfully observed than in the opening scenes where Sam attempts to kill Gollum, but is stopped by a gracious Frodo, who has taken pity on the lost soul. No doubt, Tolkien is reminding us of the power of humility over pride, and that by acting from this place of grace and forgiveness, it supports us in becoming kind, compassionate people. Elsewhere in the plot, Merry and Pippin have been captured by Uruk-hai and are being taken to an orc stronghold. It doesn't go well for the orcs, and the hobbits are able to slip away into Fangorn Forest, where they drink some magic water. and meet a very beardy tree guy. Aragorn and company run after them for a long time, a very, very long time, and eventually meet up with Éomer and the Rohirrim troops and discover that darkness is festering in the lands of Rohan. They too enter Fangorn Forest, and they meet a new leveled up Gandalf the White. Now, Gandalf the White is a huge part of this story, for as we know, Gandalf dies at the end of his fight against the Balrog, but he is sent back by Eru Ilúvatar as Gandalf the White, the most powerful of the Order of Wizards. Gandalf's passage through the mines of Moria and dying to save his companions by facing down the mighty Balrog subtly mirrors the resurrection of Christ. This is hammered home when he is shown with an enormous white aura, clad in beautiful white robes, symbolic of purity and virtue, gently reminiscent of early depictions of saints and holy men in Western religions. It would seem this is so strongly implied because Jackson chose to dub church choir music over the scene to accentuate the idea. When he first speaks, it is in the voice of Saruman. Perhaps on some level, Tolkien is unintentionally implying what quantum physics is proving now, that we and our perceptions create the reality that we experience, as everyone was expecting the White Wizard to be Saruman, and so that's who they mistook him for. Then Gandalf says something interesting. He says, "I am Saruman, or rather, I am what Saruman should have been." According to the lore, at the beginning of the age, 5 wizards were sent by Eru Ilúvatar to Middle-earth to aid in the advancement and protection of the world and all its creatures. These, of course, were Saruman the White, Gandalf the Grey, Radagast the Brown, and the 2 blue wizards who we were told went to different corners of Middle-earth to aid in their ways, but otherwise are not mentioned. Out of all of them, only Gandalf stays true to his mission to help humans. His mission is to provide guidance, resolution, and encouragement in the battle with Sauron, among other things. He genuinely cares for the inhabitants of Middle-earth, and it is this love that keeps him to his mission. Saruman, on the other hand, has no real affection for the beings of Middle-earth. He takes up his dwelling in his high tower, Orthanc, and as a result of his isolation and disconnection from the world, he becomes susceptible to the corrupting influence of power and ultimately is crushed by it. And I mean, come on, Saruman, it doesn't matter how good you once were. You make a home for yourself that looks like that, and you're just asking to become evil. Now there's a sense of dichotomy here that perhaps Gandalf was intended to represent Tolkien's form of ideal wisdom, one that at its heart comes from a sense of love and compassion. Without love, willfulness can become the pursuit of worldly power, and wisdom can degenerate into cunning. That is, the pursuit of strategies to obtain power, as happens with Saruman. Gandalf is, despite his high energy, humble, and humbleness is universally a virtue in all spiritual traditions. Indeed, modesty, compassion, and living in harmony with the spirit is seen as a higher alternative to the pursuit of power. As a side note, it's worth noting another lesson here. Although not mentioned in the film, Radagast the Brown doesn't necessarily fail. He still loves people, but he recludes himself in nature and loves animals and trees more. So much so that he forgets his mission is to help humans evolve and prosper. Radagast's quote-unquote failure is not due to a lack of love, but of loving nature more than humans, a trait that I'm sure we can all relate to in some level. Perhaps there is a lesson in balance here. All things are a part of the one, and to truly succeed and prosper, we must love and be compassionate towards all things, not just the ones that we like. Now, as a final note on the subject of wizardry, isn't it interesting that Gandalf's account of his rebirth is eerily reminiscent of Hermes' vision of creation in the Hermetica? Gandalf states that darkness took me, and I strained out of thought and mind. Stars wielded, and every day was as long as a life age of this earth. But it was not the end, for I felt life within me again. Compare this with the second book of the Hermetica, where Hermes passes into higher worlds and experiences creation. Suddenly, everything changed before me. The reality was opened out in a moment. I saw a boundless view as all became dissolved in light. I heard an unspeakable lament, an inarticulate cry of separation, until the light uttered a word, which calmed the chaotic waters. To say that the Hermetica influenced Tolkien is beyond the scope of this single episode, but reading passages like this does make you wonder. Now, Gandalf and pals then make their way to Rohan, for they are called to help bring harmony to the kingdom of men. They make their way to see Theoden and find the king of Rohan to be aged and possessed. In the film, Theoden is possessed by Saruman, who is causing this sickness, whereas in the book, he's simply depressed and deluded by Wormtongue. Ultimately, Saruman is behind it in both ways, but Peter Jackson took the approach of possession to demonstrate a physical manifestation of mental illness and negative energy, and it worked very well for the visual medium of film. Now, Grima serves as an archetypal sycophant, flatterer, liar, and manipulator, and is considered to be based by Tolkien on the untrustworthy character Unferth in the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. From a linguistic standpoint, the name Grima also comes from the Old English or Icelandic word grimo, meaning mask, helmet or covering, or specter or ghost. In the narrative, he whispers negative thoughts, insecurities, and deception into the king's ear, causing him to retreat from life and turn a blind eye to the suffering in the kingdom. In this way, perhaps we can see Wormtongue as another representative of the ego, whispering untruths into the back of our mind and making us think that we are alone and separate from each other. When we have thoughts of doubt, hate, fear, or any of these other negative emotions, and then act by them, retreat because of them, it's the same energy conveyed by Grima in this story. Ultimately, the only thing required for evil to prevail is if good people do nothing. And this is what we see happening as Theoden retreats from connecting with his own kingdom. Saruman is free to spread the evil of Mordor across the world. Now, there is a scene where he is threatened by Eomer, who asks him, "What is it Saruman promised you to do this evil work?" And Grima looks longingly at Eowyn. Now, this is part story and part amazing acting. And you can really feel that in that moment, Grima too is a human. And deep down, what he wants more than anything is to be loved. However, the path he has taken to try and get this love is one of manipulation, as he too was manipulated by Saruman. And if we follow that chain to the end, Saruman is manipulated by Sauron. And so it all comes down to this higher order of evil, making itself manifest through the people of Middle-earth. Some scholars of Tolkien have highlighted the idea that Grima is also symbolic of physical dependency, in much the same way as a drug or behavior is addictive. Theoden is addicted to Grima's whispers. This theme is echoed in the One Ring itself, as we've discussed extensively before. So in this way, the scene where Gandalf overcomes and casts out Saruman takes on new meaning. Gandalf casts out despair and banishes Theoden's ego, symbolized by both Saruman and Wormtongue. His words to Grima even echo this, as he commands him to be silent. Here, Gandalf represents the light of the soul, and that in order to truly have control over ourselves, we must banish the parts of ourselves that keep us little, weak, and afraid of the world and our responsibilities within it. Now, let's jump back over to Merry and Pippin for a moment, who are now spending some time with Treebeard and the Ents. The Ents are a fascinating species designed to be the physical personification of nature itself. They indeed share much in common with the nature spirits of European folklore, which may have even inspired their creation. Yet, they serve a higher purpose than just being a folklore insert. They give voice to nature, to Gaia and to the natural world of Middle-earth, and stand as the primary opponent to Saruman's industrialization. Nature and the environment, or rather the destruction of it, is a pervasive theme in Lord of the Rings as a whole. Several different authors and critics have observed Tolkien's environmentalism and his criticism of technology. You'll notice that the forces of evil only employ technology in the story, and that Tolkien found it to be one of the evils of the modern world: ugliness, depersonalization, and the separation of humanity from nature. It's no secret that most of the scenes with orcs tend to show industrialization on a vast scale. The churning of machines, the pollution of smoke, and the loud, destructive sounds of war all contribute to creating that feeling of evil that surrounds the orcs and the bad guys in every scene. To Tolkien, it would seem, evil and industrialism, the destruction of nature, were synonymous. Saruman's domain of Isengard, which we find to be a dark and desolate place, is actually an industrial haven. Machines work in a well-oiled fashion, and production is up. Weapons are manufactured promptly. So by our standards today, his domain is the perfect city. Yet the industrial technology imported by Saruman's minions is seen as an evil threat to harm the natural environment and to replace the traditional crafts and peaceful serenity of the Shire's hobbits with noisy, polluting mills full of machinery. Again, on a linguistic note, since we know Tolkien loved these, Saruman's name is even implied to be technology focused, coming from the Old English Mercian dialect word saru, which meant skillful or ingenious, and is also associated in Beowulf with smithcraft, being perfect for a cunning man such as Saruman. Of course, the closure of that particular arc of the story ends with all of the Ents storming Isengard, drowning the orcs by breaking the river dam and stranding Saruman in Orthon. This may even be symbolic of the notion that the earth is significantly more powerful than we give her credit for, being capable of destroying our civilizations with natural forces easily. There is a definite statement here that Mother Earth will always eventually take back what is hers. Now, the Two Towers ends with an epic battle, and both story-wise and in the film is nothing short of a masterpiece. At the end of the battle, we see Gandalf appearing on the mountainside with the Rohirrim army, and they charge down at the orcs. It's masterfully crafted in such a way that for a brief moment, we as the audience lose hope when the orcs pull up their phalanx spears. But just as that happens, the sun rises behind Gandalf and his army, blinding the orcs and faltering their formation. Now, Lord of the Rings makes use of what is known as a soft magic system, a technique in fantasy fiction where the rules and limits of magic are vaguely defined on purpose so that we don't know the full extent of a character's power. We don't know if it's Gandalf causing this blinding sun, whether it's pure lucky coincidence, or if Eru Ilúvatar is lending a helping hand, but either way, it's highly symbolic. And what the symbolism speaks to is hope returning and the power of truth, love, and goodness. It shows us that light can expel the darkness and rekindle the spirit where it has been lost. Metaphorically and physically, Gandalf brings the light to the battlefield of Helm's Deep and conquers the darkness. Now, one final, very important scene is found at the very end of the movie, which happens in Osgiliath with Frodo and Sam. Frodo expresses that he can't do this after nearly giving in to the Nazgul and the will of the ring. And like any great hero, he goes through a dark night of the soul where he loses all sense of confidence and feels like giving up on the quest. Sam then looks out over the battlefield and says, "It's all wrong. We shouldn't even be here," which is a hilarious dig at the readers of the Lord of the Rings book, because in the text, Faramir lets Frodo and Sam go very quickly, but in the film, he tries to take them to Gondor through Osgiliath on the way. It's funny because they don't even pass through this place on the book, and Sam's line is a nod to the fans who might otherwise have critiqued the scene. They really just shouldn't be there. Anyways, back to the speech. Sam says this: "The old great tales, the ones that mattered, full of darkness and danger, so much that sometimes you don't even want to know the ending, because how can the end be happy? How can the world go back to what it was before everything bad happened? But in the end, it is only a passing thing. The shadow and even darkness will pass, and when the sun shines, it will shine out ever clearer. Those are the stories that mean something, even if you were too small to understand it. All those men in our tales succeeded because they held on to something good in this world, and it is worth fighting for." This is an incredibly moving and powerful speech. Spiritually speaking, Sam is delivering an idea here about the inevitability of change, and that no matter how bad things seem at any point, always to remember that they too will pass and that nothing is permanent. We must ultimately remember that no matter what humanity faces, whatever disconnection within us causes us to abuse the natural resources of the world, and whatever suffering and strife we face collectively, is still all a part of a cycle in our great tale of human history. In time, it too will pass, and as Sam says, the sun will shine on us even brighter tomorrow. And finally, let us remember that while so many have expressed that they need a friend like Sam, we would do well to not forget to try to be more like him too. Lift each other up, check in on your friends and family, spread compassion, and rekindle hope like Gandalf when you see it waning. At last, we have arrived at the epic conclusion of The Lord of the Rings. And whoa, there is a lot to unpack in this movie. From messianic symbolism to the Witch King of Angmar, this story is filled with nuggets of wisdom. Not to mention some badass scenes and speeches that'll make you want to jump up off your couch and slay a dragon. The movie opens with the cautionary tale of Smeagol and Deagol, giving us the much requested backstory of how Gollum came to find the ring and eventually became what he is at the time of the main story. As it goes, his brother Deagol finds it after being pulled into the river by a fish. Don't ask. And Smeagol takes one look at the ring and kills his brother so that he can has it for himself. This scene is especially strong in identifying the power of the ring to manipulate others, and the power it especially has over the weak-minded in order to really grasp the darkness of the ring. Once Smeagol puts it on, everything changes. He describes that he was cursed, his people abandoned him, and he retreated into the mountains in solitude to transform into a monster. His tragic account of this transformation is made even more intense by focusing on his forgetting of nature, as he tells us that we forgot the taste of bread and the sound of trees, the softness of the wind, and in time, we even forgot our own name. He forgets all of the things that make life beautiful, completely disconnected from his soul. Soon, we're back with Frodo and Sam, and it seems that the closer they get to Mount Doom, the heavier the ring becomes. Sam remarks that they must have slept in since it's starting to get dark, but Frodo points out that it's only midday and that the days are just getting darker. Besides being just literal, it also seems to be an allusion to Sauron's power, and by extent, the darkness, which is growing and spreading across the world. We may also do well to remember that it is often darkest just before the dawn, and that this darkness is signaling the final battle. The use of weather itself is actually quite strong in the movies. Remember during Helm's Deep, when Gandalf brought a new rising sun with him that blinded the orcs? It would seem as though dark clouds have a similar energy in Mordor. Just as Gandalf brings the light, Sauron doesn't just represent darkness. He is darkness, he brings darkness, and his influence is spreading. Back in Isengard, Merry and Pippin are having a blast and relaxing on a battlefield of dead orcs. Gandalf and company arrive, and a conversation ensues about what to do with Saruman. While Gimli wants to kill him, Gandalf explains that since he has no more power, but plenty of information, he must be kept alive. Gandalf does his best to convert Saruman to the light side of the Force, but to no avail, and Saruman's stubbornness and even his own cruelty eventually does him in. Now, turns out beating the Saruman level boss is actually a good thing because he had one of the best loot drops ever, a Palantir, an ancient elven seeing stone. But oh shucks, it's cursed. And like the ring, it instantly grabs Pippin's attention. He wants it, he does. Now, these Palantir things are actually pretty interesting all on their own. Ignoring the fact that there's a data analyzing company called Palantir Technologies in California, the Palantiri were seeing stones made by the elves to communicate before being given to the Atlanteans, the Numenorians, and eventually finding their way into the Great Towers after the fall. Now, the stones actually could be used to see for miles, or sometimes show the thoughts of their users. Perhaps in the future, we humans could develop something like that. Just imagine 10 generations of internet from now, we just stare into these crystal balls and have all the information and communication just beam to and from our minds. That'd be kind of fun. Anyways, the use of Palantirs in the books go even deeper. Denethor's fear and attachment to his ego that is later seen in Gondor makes much more sense as Tolkien tells us that he secretly had his own Palantir and would use it to gain forbidden knowledge. Denethor thought at first he had the power to stand against Sauron, and for some time he was able to actually mentally withstand that power. But upon seeing the advancements of Sauron's armies in the days before the siege of Gondor, Denethor turned to complete despair and became the guy we see in the movies. Spiritually speaking, this theme of forbidden knowledge is something present in most mythologies, and almost every time, it comes with a price. Knowledge will always be revealed at the perfect time, and searching for it unjustly will cause nothing but danger. There is actually a story from ancient Egypt about the mysterious Book of Thoth, which upon reading it would transform mortals to have the awareness and powers of gods. However, upon doing so, tremendous consequences would befall them because this power has to be earned, not taken by force. Right, sorry, Lord of the Rings. So now we jump to Rohan and everyone is partying it up in the throne room, mourning their dead and feasting. You know, things that probably go pretty well together. And Éowyn gives Aragorn a chalice to drink from. And this is just an almost perfect mirror to not only King Arthur and the Grail, but also the Eucharist ritual celebrated by Christians, further cementing the whole Aragorn Jesus symbolism. I mean, hey, he even looks like our depictions of Christ, though Gandalf really is the one who rocks the white robes, for sure. Now, during the party, Aragorn and Gandalf discuss how Frodo is doing. Aragorn asks Gandalf, "What does your heart tell you?" And now I know this phrase is super common, but it sure does pack weight. Listening to the heart is the way we connect with truth, for it comes from both love and wisdom. In this, Gandalf gives a deep smile as knowing flows through him that Frodo is alive. I think it's also worth mentioning that one of the most profound things you can do for someone is ask them a profound question, demonstrated beautifully by this scene. Back on the not-so-yellow brick road to Mount Doom, we find our favorite hobbits asleep and Gollum talking to his own reflection. Smee Gollum is discussing plans with himself to kill the hobbits, but Sam overhears and, well, he wasn't exactly a fan of that conversation. What's curious is that Smee Gollum explains Smeagol wouldn't hurt a fly as he kills one accidentally that lands on his head. But really, it's here we have this split personality again, the Jungian shadow self that we explored earlier. The ring has split his psyche in two, and based on the conversations that they have with each other, it seems as though Smeagol and Gollum actually have different memories or thoughts, so divided inside that they actually manifest as two separate personalities in one body. Anyway, that's something that we've already explored, so let's tag in with Arwen for a moment. There's something interesting about her departure from the world, as this scene is very natural, peaceful, yet sad in its tranquility. There's a sense of fleeing from a dying world, but the divine feminine will not let go upon realizing that there is a greater truth that she had not seen before, that while there is death in her future with Aragorn, there is life also. Here we have another message of sacrifice. For staying in these lands, she gives up more of her power, but she has chosen love above all else. In this, she convinces Elrond to reforge the sword of Excalibur. No, sorry, that was a typo. The Master Sword pulled from the stone in Hyrule Forest. Sorry, no, that's not it either. Anduril, that's the one. Now, Anduril isn't any old sword. It's the blade of the true Redeemer King. Anduril means Flame of the West in Elvish and is supposed to represent Aragorn's right to rule. It really does seem to have been based off of the mythical Excalibur, as Tolkien tells us that very bright was the sword when it was made whole again. The light of the sun shone readily within it, and the light of the moon shone cold, and its edge was hard and keen. This is actually a direct call back to the King Arthur legend, where when Excalibur was drawn, it was said to shine with the light of 100 suns, so strong that it blinded any enemy who looked at it. Interestingly, when Elrond gives him the sword, he states that the crownless shall be king. Up until this point, Aragorn had still been the ranger, holding on to this lesser perception of himself. Elrond explains that it is now time to switch classes, equip a sword with higher hit points, and step into his birthright as the true king of Gondor. From a philosophical perspective, this speaks volumes to self-authenticity. Too often we pretend to be someone else in our lives, attaching labels to ourselves that define us in our society. But what is being said here is that only by shedding those labels and being true to yourself can you ascend to be the highest form of you. And who knows, that new you might even be a king compared to the old you. Now, Minas Tirith, dang. This is a city that just looks and feels pure, as if you know the good guys live here. Although, at this point in the story, it could use some new management, if you know what I mean. The way it's laid out is reminiscent of geometry, built on 7 levels, each of concentric circles rising higher than the previous one. In a way, it's like a 3D version of Plato's account of Atlantis. At the very top, we see the Citadel, which has a cross in the center leading to the white tree in the middle of a fountain. This layout probably wasn't an accident given how much Tolkien loved the story of Atlantis. Also, it's worth mentioning that if we really wanted to, humans could totally build a city like this today. Sure, it would take some work, but imagine how beautiful it would be and what kind of things it would inspire within the human consciousness if we were to do so. Up until this point, we haven't yet been properly introduced to Denethor. And when we do, let's just say, probably not what we'd expect from the king of a place like this, but I guess that's why he's just the steward. Perhaps Tolkien is implying that good and evil are kind of subjective, and it's ultimately about personal choice that determines our reality, rather than the positions that we're in. This is reinforced later on when Gandalf explains to Pippin that, well, there was never really much hope, just a fool's hope. It seems like he's placing a bigger emphasis on personal effort than position or fate. Later on, when Pippin lights the beacons, against Denethor's command, I might add, they produce a chain reaction of spreading fire that causes all of the other beacons to be lit, eventually making their way back to Aragorn, who, along with Rohan, begins to ride to Gondor's aid. This scene reminds us of a Buddhist quote that says, "Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of that candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases from being shared, only expands." In this line of thought, with fire and light representing enlightenment, All it takes is for one beacon to be lit, to start a chain reaction that will eventually allow others to light their own beacons, so to speak, and ultimately bring about the salvation of Gondor. For if Rohan didn't ride, Gondor would have fallen. There might also be a lesson here about being willing to ask for help, even if we're too stubborn to really actually do it. Once again, when the Nazgul begin to attack, Gandalf comes galloping in and shines the light of God in their faces, driving them off. We saw this before, but light has this amazing ability to dispel darkness. And that's not just a metaphor, it's a scientific fact. Speaking of darkness though, we also have a side story that is very important, and the truth that descending into darkness can bring about great revelations, as is the case with the army of the dead. On the surface, it seems as if the evil mountain eventually holds the keys to victory, speaking to the idea that in order to illuminate the darkness within, we must descend into the darkness in order to come out on the other side. Now, this army of the dead is a whole video on its own, but to go into it a little bit, the men of the mountain were cursed by Isildur when they agreed to help him fight Sauron, only to desert him in his hour of need. And so they were banished to the mountain until the next true king could release them. The whole aspect of the story is a part of Aragorn's hero's journey, in that he basically goes into an underworld type place, the realm of the dead. When they get to the door, it is naturally shut off because the place is only meant for the dead, not the living, leading to a funny exchange between Legolas and Gimli that it's unheard of. An elf running underground and a dwarf dare not? Again, this reminds us of the ideas of labels from earlier, and how it's almost a complete role reversal, speaking to how our true natures can shine through once we stop assigning ourselves to certain traits or groups. And so when we first meet the dead, they are terrifying, as they probably ought to be. Yet they seem to have created a very nice little city structure down under the mountain, with cool glowing staircases and skulls everywhere. The Wraith King points out at one point that only the true king can redeem them and thus command them. And Aragorn then shows his rightful position by grabbing the king, being the only one who can touch the dead, and showing him Anduril, confirming his kingship. All this talk of redemption should sound familiar, as it's a key part that signifies Aragorn as a Christ-like figure. The undead army are symbolic of the damned, sinners in a way, and only the King of Kings can redeem them. This section is strongly inspired by Messianic mythology, indicating that even the damned can be redeemed by the grace of the noble, if they are willing to serve. Back at the battle, Denethor has resolved to burn himself and his son on a pyre. And, oh my God, you are so dumb. I'm sorry. Faramir is just so obviously alive, and Denethor honestly could probably have noticed, except his ego seemed to have drowned in a combination of sadness of loss and disgust that Faramir is not Boromir. It's kind of weird. Thank heavens for Pippin and Gandalf, who rush in to save the day. Gandalf gives Denethor the old 1-2, and Denethor eventually realizes that his son is still alive. Illuminated by this valiant truth, Denethor is so excited that he screams in fiery, bloody murder and runs to his death. And nobody cares, because they're all fighting a much bigger war. And the way that this is shown is actually kind of funny, because as we zoom out, we see Denethor fall off the top of the city, and it just keeps zooming out to see the totality of the battle. And it really just shows how petty his own ego was in the face of all that they were battling against. And speaking of that battle, isn't it curious that the orcs demonstrably feel fear as well? When the soldiers of Gondor begin to fight back and launch their own catapults, we see the orcs visibly afraid. It's as if to remind us that fear too is a universal trait, one that isn't unique to only one side of the warring spectrum. Meanwhile, in the traveling tribe of short people, Gollum has deceived Frodo into telling Sam to go home. And as he's climbing down the mountain, Sam happens to come across tricksy business. And Frodo and Gollum at the top of the mountain make their way into Shelob's cave for tea and crumpets. I mean, death, imminent death. Yes, that. Fortunately, Frodo is armed with the pure light of Lothlorien, and after Gollum seemingly falls to his death, Frodo makes use of this gift, the elven starlight, lighting the darkness around him. This light seems to drive Shelob away, almost as if she just can't even get close to it, which might be due to it being a pure elvish tool, or like how purity repels chaos, as we saw with Gollum earlier. Shelob herself is a very interesting discussion because of what spiders represent. For humans in the world today, fear of spiders, arachnophobia, is one of the most common fears in the world. It is very interesting. Why are we so afraid of these little spiders? Is it because they are some of the fiercest predators of the insect kingdom? Perhaps their ability to produce beautiful yet terrifying webs scare us for some reason. Or is there a mystery hidden in our ancient past that has left the fear of spiders locked in our DNA as a species? Whatever the reason, a giant spider was the perfect fit for Shelob, as our human consciousness today instantly associates it with a dark or sinister force. And that is reinforced very well by Shelob. Yet at the same time, we might just be invited to use this opportunity to reflect on our own arachnophobia if we have any. When we see a little spider, especially, not a giant poisonous one, which is a little less common in the world, and we have a fear response, let's ask ourselves, I'm 1,000 times larger than you and you pose no threat to me. Why am I afraid? And just see what your mind comes up with in response. Anyways, back at the battle, Pippin and Gandalf at one point are faced with a giant army of orcs. And in his terror, Pippin asks the wizard if it's the end. And in true mystic wisdom fashion, Gandalf once again delivers a powerful speech that echoes the words of the Hermetica. End? Oh, the journey doesn't end here. Death is simply another path, one that we all must take. Everything rolls back and turns to silver clouds, and then you see it. White shores and beyond, a far green country moving into a swift sunrise. A description of paradise seemingly mirroring that of the Christian heaven. But the idea of seeing death as simply another part in the journey is incredibly important in any ascension process. In usual fashion, Gandalf helps to ease fear, but in this sense, it isn't a physical fear in the moment, but the biggest fear of all, the fear of death. Pippin remarks that, it doesn't sound so bad actually, arguably echoing all of our collective thoughts when thinking about transitioning from this life if we look at it from this inherently spiritual perspective. We also here cannot understate the importance of Éowyn and her killing of the Witch King. Now the Witch King himself actually seems to be a little bit like an evil Jesus character, What with his own crown of metal barbed thorns? He himself has a sort of evil blessing curse upon him too. No man can kill him. Yet Éowyn in the midst of battle reveals that she is no man and blows his mind with a sword to the face. Herein we find a subtle reference to the power of the divine feminine and the fall of the patriarchal energy in the world at the hands of the noble woman. Finally, Aragorn's arrival scene is interesting as he arrives in one of the orc boats that was supposed to bring reinforcements. Naturally, the orcs think that they are allies until Aragorn reveals himself. Thinking someone is something else because of an outwardly appearance, does that sound familiar? This scene similarly mirrors exactly what happens in the Two Towers, where Gandalf the White first revealed himself to the Fellowship and appeared a little bit like Sauron. What's more, we find that the battle is just over the moment they arrive. These dead warriors cannot be beat. They instantly take down the enemy and the battle is won. There must here be some wisdom in the sense that drawing upon forces outside of the physical dimension, we can accomplish great things a bajillion times easier than if we try and brute force our way through the challenge. As the hobbits get closer to Mount Doom, seeing the garrison makes Frodo lose hope, but Sam reminds him to simply make it to the bottom of the hill first. It's a kind of the journey begins with a single step mentality. Something may seem daunting at first, but breaking it down into steps and completing each one is all that's required. It doesn't matter really, getting to Mordor or spiritual enlightenment, both are a step-by-step process, and one that must be approached with patience. Once the hobbits reach the threshold, however, Gandalf loses all sense of them, which prompts an incredibly reflective scene. Gandalf actually appears afraid for a moment, stating that he has sent the hobbits to their death. And actually he too seems to lose hope. Now up until this point, it has been Gandalf who rekindles the hope when it is lost. And this scene begs the question, what happens when the main support guy needs support himself? It's actually Aragorn who comes up with the plan to march upon the Black Gate and distract Sauron, even though Gandalf doesn't think it'll work. It's like sometimes even the best of us are still human and subject to fear. Even those who are on the path of enlightenment doubt themselves. As the forces of good march upon the Black Gate, we enter the final chapter of the story. At the entrance of Mount Doom, we see a struggling Frodo, weighed heavily by the ring, unable to continue. Sam tries to rekindle his spirit by reminding him of the beautiful natural imagery of the Shire. Yet, at this point, Frodo is so exhausted that he can't even remember the good things in life and sees only darkness. At this, the end of the journey, Frodo has lost hope, and without Sam to prop him up and aid him, as is true many times, he would have failed. This is very important because generally in Lord of the Rings, Frodo is glorified, and Samwise is often considered the comic relief, or as Gollum puts it, the stupid fat hobbit. We even see this in pop culture today. For example, there's an episode of The Big Bang Theory where everyone's fighting over who gets to dress up as Frodo for a costume party. But Sam? Psh, nobody wants to be Sam. Yet, Sam is one of the most important heroes of the story. Of course, Frodo had to be the one to carry the ring, but by the end, he was mostly an empty shell, his spirit completely worn away by the evil of the ring. It's because of Samwise that Frodo was able to make it at all, and he deserves just all of the medals for such courage and bravery. But now, don't get me wrong, I'm not understating the importance of Frodo here. There is some especially strong messianic symbolism here that simply cannot be ignored. Much like Jesus carrying his cross for the sins of mankind, Frodo carries a burden of evil on behalf of the whole world. He literally walks his own Via Dolorosa to Mount Doom, just like Jesus making his way to Golgotha. And as he approaches the cracks of doom, the ring becomes a crushing weight, just as the cross was for Jesus. Sam, who carried Frodo up to Mount Doom, parallels Simon of Cyrene, who helps Jesus by carrying his cross too. Once making it up Mount Doom, overlooking the fiery lava below, and overpowered by the might of Sauron, Frodo's own spirit gives in completely, and he declares that he will keep the ring. At long last, the crushing burden that he bore has broken him, and all of the darkness within has taken over. Parallels have been made here to Jesus' time in the desert, where he was tempted by the devil. And speak of the devil, oh look, it's Gollum. Isn't it so interesting that Gollum, in his final moments, returns just in time to become the tragic hero, leading to the destruction of the ring? This also fulfills the ideas of Gandalf from long ago, that Gollum still has a part to play in this story, a very important part. Could you imagine if he wasn't there? It probably wouldn't have ended well for anyone without Gollum. Gollum the Brave. Further, it's also no accident that the ring can only be destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom where it was created. It's as if to say that darkness can only truly be destroyed at its source. What's more, after the ring is gone, Frodo's spirit returns, and he once again can see the natural imagery that Sam described of the Shire. So of course, they're picked up by eagles and whisked away home. And after waking up back in Rivendell, Frodo is reunited with the Fellowship and his old friends, and the general energy and tone is, well, as expected, quite cheerful. The darkness has been destroyed, and a new age is beginning. Aragorn is crowned the rightful king, and we have this incredibly touching moment where everyone bows to the king, but the king stops and says, "My friends, you bow to no one." Think about this for a moment. The king bows to the hobbits. This is such a powerful scene, demonstrating humility, respect, and honor to those who have sacrificed more than anyone in the entire story. How can we relate to this in our own lives? Who do we know in our lives who have made incredible sacrifices? Who can we show our respect and honor to by honoring them for their service to the greater good? As their time in the East comes to an end, the hobbits return to the Shire. We see a funny little scene where Sam resolves to ask out his crush Rosie after a few drinks, signifying that even after all of the questing, all of the darkness and epic battles that happened, love still prevails. There's actually a classic archetype about the sacred wedding in the completion of a story, and Lord of the Rings hits it perfectly, not just once, but twice, both with Aragorn and Arwen and Sam and Rosie. Yet, something stirs in the heart of the Shire. Frodo shares a feeling relatable to anyone who has been or is currently going through an awakening process. He asks, how do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? This arguably is one of the hardest parts of experiencing a spiritual or transcendent awakening. Once you begin to see the world in a different way, from an inherently spiritual perspective, You will never want to return to old paradigms or ways of thinking. Your old life and paradigms will often be changed and stretched so dramatically that it feels as if your world may be falling apart. Yet, the overriding message is that if we stick with this inner transformation, it will lead to amazing things. While growth can sometimes be painful, it will always lead to something better. Like how strange a caterpillar must feel inside the cocoon, mixing up its genetics and everything. But boy, is flying awesome once the transformation is complete. When Frodo accomplishes his mission, like Jesus, he says, "It is done." Just as Christ ascending to heaven, Frodo's life in Middle-earth comes to an end when he departs to the undying lands of the elves, a place where only the purest of heart may go. Frodo, Bilbo, and Gandalf depart into the west, and this is truly symbolic of the final ascension of the soul. Upon finding completion, they move from one world into another, a greater kingdom beyond the borders of their own world. It is a majestic ending and could not be more perfect, topped with a cherry at the end with a scene of Sam returning home and finding his child and wife waiting for him. A beautiful scene showing the cyclical nature of the world order and the transition into a new life. To us, the hidden spirituality of Lord of the Rings is not so much hidden, but rather is woven into the story in such a way that it expresses philosophies, mystic ideas, and wisdom in ways that illuminates our consciousness about concepts such as good, evil, and the ascension process. I trust that throughout this exploration, we too have helped to shine deeper light for all of us the next time we go to enjoy this story. With that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon on the next episode of Spirit Science.